Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's today's guest host, Michelle Dover.
Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Press the Button. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund, and I am hosting Press the Button while Joe is taking some well-deserved time off in Cape Cod. He claims he'll be back, but we'll see about that. We are going to do a deep dive today on the legislative developments around the National Defense Authorization Act on our early warning news segment. And we are joined by Ploughshares' very own Director of Policy, Tom Collina, and Program Coordinator at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, Abigail Stowe-Thurston. After that, you'll hear Joe's recent interview with Suzanne DiMaggio. Suzanne is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and is the upcoming chairman of the board at the soon-to-be-launched Quincy Institute. She specializes in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and Asia and shares her insights on the latest news coming out of both regions. As always, if you like what you hear, remember to comment, share, subscribe, and rate. We love to hear from you, our loyal listeners, and it helps us make the show better. I also have a special request. While Joe is out of the office, we are collecting questions from our listeners about what they're interested in, what they have questions on related to nuclear news, or issues in the nuclear space that maybe you just don't understand. And so if you could send us those questions at pressthebutton@ploughshares.org. We are going to make Joe answer these questions when he gets back, and we will include that in the podcast. So please send us your questions. But first, the news.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm here with our Director of Policy, Tom Collina, and Program Coordinator at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, Abigail Stowe-Thurston. This is an especially exciting early warning because it is the first time for both of you being on Press the Button. Welcome and thank you.
Thanks for having us, Michelle.
Before we dive in, I wanted to congratulate Abigail, who was just named a recipient of a grant under Ploughshares' request for proposals through our Women's Initiative. Congrats!
Very exciting.
Listeners can learn more about this work and other awardees at ploughshares.org. All right. We are going to do a deep dive on the National Defense Authorization Bill today. So we want to jump right into it. The missiles are coming. We have 7 minutes. Let's go. On Friday, the House of Representatives approved its defense authorization bill 220 to 197. No Republicans supported the typically bipartisan measure, and by typically bipartisan, I mean over the past 58 years. Abigail, I read that one of the reasons the Republicans did not vote for it was actually related to language around certain nuclear weapons. What does the bill include, and what does that mean?
So the bill coming out of the House Armed Services Committee restricts funding to deploy the W76-2 nuclear warhead, and that's a lower yield warhead that would be deployed on our D5 missiles and our submarines. This is a weapon that was specifically requested in the Trump administration's nuclear posture review, and there's been a lot of debate over whether it's necessary and whether it creates additional escalatory risks if we were, in a conflict with Russia or something like that. So the bill restricted funding for that weapon to be deployed, and in the House on the floor there was some debate over whether that restriction should be removed. And there were some amendments that were offered to that effect. All of them were defeated with Democratic votes. So the House bill, as it stands, won't allow that weapon to be deployed.
Got it. And I'm assuming that language is not in the Senate version.
No, the Senate version does not include that language, so that will be something to work out in conference.
And Tom, a follow-up question I had to that, how do you feel about the top line of the House version? We're looking at, some of these like really specific nuclear aspects, but, this is a part of a broader package, and the trade-offs we're making is for some of these controversial amendments, higher total bill.
Right. I mean, to me, the House bill contains $733 billion for defense,
a lot.
Which to me is way too much. And in fact, this became a problem for the final passage of the bill because some progressive Democrats thought it was too much as well and didn't want to vote for $733 billion for defense. And because they knew that all of the Republicans were probably going to vote against the bill, and in fact they did, there couldn't be many Democratic defections from the bill or else the whole bill would not have passed. So there was a real effort to try to work with progressive Democrats to allow them to offer amendments to the bill, some of which passed, some of which didn't, but I think helped them feel better about the process and allowed them ultimately to vote for the bill. But I don't think we should assume that the fact that the bill passed with that much defense spending means that there's broad Democratic support for that level. I think they just felt this is the best we can do. We got some good language in here. Let's see where it goes. But I think defense spending overall is going to be an issue going forward.
Got it. And so, among these types of amendments, I believe you've been following some related to Congress's authority to declare war.
Yeah, so I think one of the most significant pieces of one of the most significant amendments to come on to this bill was an amendment by Congressman Khanna, a bipartisan amendment to limit the president's ability to engage in war with Iran. And so this amendment passed with 27 Republican votes, which was one of the strongest shows of bipartisanship on this bill. And I think it was a very clear statement by the House that they do not support war with Iran and do not support President Trump pursuing war with Iran, at least without congressional approval. And there were a number of other elements in this bill that shows that Congress is really trying to reestablish its authority on war powers and declaration of war, I think as a clear statement of distrust or discomfort of what President Trump is doing. Of course, we all know not too long ago he was minutes away from launching military action against Iran and has said that he feels that he has authorities right now to initiate war with Iran without asking Congress. So a lot of discomfort with the president's activities on the war front with Iran, and we're seeing that in how the Democrats in the House, with Republican support, crafted this bill.
So we've covered nuclear weapons, we've covered Iran. Was there anything related to North Korea in it as well?
Yes, indeed. Another amendment, again, by Congressman Khanna to support ending the Korean War after 69 years and having that be an important part of efforts to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. So that was seen as a real effort on the part of Congress to say we want to solve this problem diplomatically, not militarily, and that ending of the war there should be part of that dynamic.
So this was the House version. As I mentioned, the Senate's already passed their version. So time to iron out the differences in conference. Abigail, what do you expect to see?
So it's a little unclear what will happen next. As you mentioned, the two bills are substantially different, and we talked about some of those differences in the nuclear space. Representative Adam Smith has been crystal clear that his top priority is to get a bill on the president's desk for signature, and that will require some compromises. There are a number of things in the House version that Senate Republicans will unequivocally oppose, so there's going to have to be some kind of negotiation there. That said, it's not entirely clear what those compromises will be yet.
Great. And Tom, do you have any predictions?
Well, we certainly hope that the Senate will uphold the prohibition on deployment of the low-yield warhead. This really comes down to what Senator Jack Reed does as the Democratic leader on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We hope very much that he supports Adam Smith's language from his bill to prohibit the deployment of low-yield nuclear weapons, and we'll just have to see where it goes. We're hopeful also that the prohibition on war with Iran without congressional approval will also survive, because last month the Senate, a majority of the Senate voted to also put limits on president's authority. There was a 60-vote threshold, so that failed to pass, but it did have majority support. Of course, even if those things get through the conference, President Trump could still veto the bill. But again, this is going to be at least $733 billion for defense spending that Trump wants, and probably more once they compromise this process. So the hope is that even if there are a few things in this bill that President Trump does not like, he will support the overall bill.
Great. So it's something we will be coming back to ask you both what you think of the results of these discussions. But first, before we sign off, we have a couple more seconds. Did either of you see the story about the Kardashian sisters going to an event related to nuclear this weekend?
Yes. So Kim and Kourtney Kardashian showed up at an event to commemorate the partial meltdown at the Santa Susana Field Lab in California. It's about 10 miles from their house, and that's how they learned about it. They are advocating for that site to be cleaned up in its entirety. So it's great to see celebrities getting engaged on some of these issues.
I mean, I will say I had no idea that this field lab was out there, that it was doing nuclear and rocket testing. And so, you know, it was, if it was able to enter my world, since I really don't follow this, you know, that was pretty significant. Tom, did you happen to see this?
I did, and all I can say is that if the Kardashians want to get more involved in nuclear weapons issues, we welcome them heartily. In fact, they could come on this show, and we would love to have them.
That would be awesome. Okay, making the pitch now to the universe. Kardashians, come on our show. Okay, no, with that, 7 minutes are up. Thank you both for joining us, and we look forward to talking further.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
I'm joined in the Washington, D.C. headquarters of Ploughshares Fund by Suzanne DiMaggio, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East and Asia, especially Iran and North Korea, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But also, she is now the new chairman of the board of the soon-to-be-launched Quincy Institute, and we will talk a little bit about that, too. Suzanne, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Joe. It's so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great. We talk a lot, but we rarely have done it with microphones in front of our faces, so this takes a little getting used to. But thank you for coming in, and we have three things, really, to talk about: Iran, North Korea, the new Quincy Institute. By the way, how do you say it? Quincy or Quincy? How do you say it?
I say Quincy, but I was a fan of that old Jack Klugman series, Quincy.
Yes.
M.E., where he played the doctor. So he pronounced it Quincy, so I pronounced it Quincy.
Quincy, okay. Well, good.
I'm dating myself.
One of the first things we have to settle. But let's start with a more serious topic of Iran. This is a slow-building crisis that sometimes moves in spurts. Sometimes we seem to be closer to a war. Sometimes we seem to be edging back to the possibility of negotiations. Here in the middle of July in 2019, how do you see this crisis? What do you think we are with the U.S. and Iran?
Well, I'm not at all optimistic because the Trump administration has been on a steady run just of maximum pressure only. So when we withdrew from the deal, which is well over a year ago now, I have been advocating very quietly for creating off-ramps along the way that we could diffuse these tensions and perhaps get back to talks. But there has been no opening for off-ramps, and I don't see any on the horizon. So we have to ask ourselves at this stage of the game, we've levied practically every sanction imaginable against Iran, and we're hitting them hard, but towards what end? It's still unclear to me what is the strategy of this maximum pressure campaign. Depending on who I talk to, sometimes I hear it's to get the Iranians back to the table. Well, we know pressure doesn't work to get the Iranians back to the table. We have to find a way to allow them to save face and come back with dignity. Some people say it's to get the Iranian people to rise up against the government because they're hurting so poorly and depose them. But we know from past experience that when the Iranian system and the society is threatened by us, what happens? They galvanize around the government. They become united against this threat. And that's precisely what we see happening. We see the Revolutionary Guard certainly gaining steam. We see the more moderate element of the government, the pro-engagement element, marginalized at this stage.
I mean, President Rouhani, foreign minister.
And in fact, I think they have had to move their approach more towards the hard line. So I really don't see any way to, unless and until the United States comes to the realization that we have to find a way to give the Iranians the space, like we did in the run-up to the nuclear deal. People mistakenly say, oh, it was the sanctions, it was the pressure that brought the Iranians to the table. But you know better than anyone that, yes, the sanctions played a role, but it was actually when Bill Burns spoke to the Iranians in the secret talks and said, the United States is ready and willing to allow you to have a uranium enrichment program on your soil under the condition that it's heavily monitored and inspected. That was the turning point.
Right.
That was the turning point. That was the way out. That was the off-ramp. Right now, we just have pressure, no off-ramps, and that's what's leaving me so pessimistic.
Right. So the Iranians have no indication that if they were to talk to the United States, that there would be some sort of resolution that is something else than them playing the role of the Japanese on the deck of the USS Missouri and offering their complete surrender.
Yes, the direction we're going, all pressure all the time, virtually guarantees that the Iranians will not come back to the table. So we have to ask the architects and the implementers of this policy, is that indeed their aim? Make sure the Iranians don't come back to the table, make sure they come out of their nuclear deal commitments, and cut a path towards a conflict. I think that is possible. And with this administration, there's such a lack of coherence across the board. But on this particular issue, there is a lot of incoherence happening.
So you talked about the factions inside Iran. What about the factions inside the United States? Do you think there's contending points of view inside the administration?
Yes, let's start with President Trump. I, like many, believe he actually does not want to see a military conflict with the Iranians. But is he skilled enough to manage a spiral before it gets out of control? I think the answer is no. So it's very dangerous. And then you have Bolton, who clearly wants to lead us into a conflict with Iran. This has been the basis of his philosophy for decades.
How often does a man have to say this before you believe him?
Yes.
This is what he wants, bomb Iran.
And I believed him the first time.
Yeah.
And we should believe him now. This is the 20th go-around for him. And then you have someone like Pompeo, who's in between. He's there to serve the president. I think that's his main mission. With Pompeo, you have a politician at heart. He's looking to another position. He's politically ambitious. He probably has his sights on the presidency, right?
I agree.
And I think, another war for the U.S. in the Middle East is not the way to get to the presidency.
Exactly. I think Mike Pompeo was the Frank Underwood of this administration.
Yes.
He was an obscure congressman from Kansas. Suddenly he's head of the Intelligence Committee, then he's the head of the CIA, then he outmaneuvers the existing Secretary of State, he becomes Secretary of State. His ambitions don't stop there.
And in contrast, this is Bolton's last rodeo.
Yes.
He wants to go out with a bang, right? And the bang is Iran.
And the clock is ticking.
Yes.
So this is what worries me the most, that if he more than anybody else, with his vice-like grip on the national security apparatus, if he wants to go to war, he basically has to do it this year. What do you think? As we get closer to 2020, how do the dynamics change?
Well, now that we're entering the campaign season full swing, Trump's reelection campaign, I'm not surprised he pulled out from the 10 minutes to war scenario. Yes, we can have a whole conversation that he was the arsonist that brought us to the brink, but he did step away, and I think much to Bolton's chagrin. So the question is, as we move forward in this political campaign season, is Bolton going to be marginalized? Is he going to be able to keep Trump on this war path? I mean, it's very...
Because you think Trump is going to be less and less willing to risk a war in the heat of the campaign.
Yes, but we shouldn't lull ourselves to sleep on this, because that alone isn't going to save us. The fact of the matter is that Trump is hot-headed. He says he's famously unpredictable, and we know he could easily stumble into a war. We could have a miscalculation and something could happen on the Iranians' part, too.
Yes.
Not just ours. This is a tinderbox that I think is waiting to ignite. And keep in mind, I know we're going to talk about North Korea, but on North Korea, right before the Hanoi summit, we all thought that the U.S. was going to come to the table in a more flexible way, and suddenly we found out it was more inflexible than we thought. And what happened? We saw Trump put forward a proposal that was basically all in, denuclearize up front, and throw in biological and chemical weapons. It essentially, and missiles. It essentially was the Libya deal.
Yes.
He came to the table. I think Bolton convinced him to present this big deal. I don't think Trump, not knowing the history, the context, had no idea he was presenting the North Koreans with the Libya deal. And when I've spoken to North Koreans over the years, they consistently bring up Libya and what happened to Gaddafi as their biggest nightmare. So I don't even think Trump was aware what he was doing.
Right.
And I think we should go into Iran with the same understanding that he may be exploited by Bolton in the same way, due to his lack of understanding about the Iranians, due to his lack of understanding about the history between our countries. It worries me a great deal.
You know, I was watching the Bill Maher show on HBO just a couple of days ago, and Tulsi Gabbard is on, and she says she's very worried about the risk of war. And Bill Maher dismisses her as saying, no, Trump doesn't want to go to war and he's the boss. But I agree with you. This is a boss that can be manipulated, that can be tricked, that can make mistakes. And on the Iranian side, you've got these factional fights that could result in a Revolutionary Guard commander pushing a regime that doesn't really want to go to war into one.
Exactly. I completely agree with that scenario. And I don't think we should be lulled into complacency on the fact that Trump, in his heart, does not want a war.
Yes, so let's turn to North Korea. For those listeners who don't know, you spend a lot of your time talking to North Koreans, talking to Iranians, more so than most Americans realize. You have these, well, some people, including you, have these channels, and you hear what they say, and you talk about what they say. Is it fair to say that you also can act somewhat as a go-between between the North Koreans and the U.S., the Iranians and the U.S.?
It depends on the circumstances. I mean, I have to say, these past months, especially since Hanoi, it's been crickets with the North Koreans. Mm-hmm. They have really turned inward to regroup. I think that's the word we can use. They have had a reshuffling of their negotiators. And we've heard a lot of
that's a nice word for it.
A lot of stories about what has happened to those negotiators. I think some were a little outlandish, more outlandish than they actually were. But I think we have to first understand that North Korea itself is going through its own fits and starts.
Tell me.
I think there is now it's clear to me at least, and I think others, that there is a growing debate within the North Korean elite over a traditional guns versus butter debate. How far to go with this demilitarization versus the economy? And it's unclear to know who's winning that debate because it's so opaque. So I think, I think we should be careful not to assume Kim Jong-un is 100% absolute leader. I think he has some constituencies that he has to appeal to. And, it's rather remarkable that he has come out so publicly in North Korea about his goal now is to advance the economy. They have a nuclear program, they have the missile delivery program. Now it's time to turn to the economy. And I think this is what gives us the most leverage, is that now he's put himself on the line. To some extent, he staked his credibility to economic development. And we should be exploiting that. And I don't see that we are.
Well, wait a minute. Trump has done a flashy video about the prosperity that awaits North Korea. He emphasizes this all the time.
That's not the prosperity they have in mind. They don't see themselves as becoming the next Singapore. In fact, I think they would think that's the end of their regime. They don't want to open up in that way. I think they want to return to their traditional trading partners on a very limited few, and have these sanctions lifted. I am a proponent of a approach that is action for action and phased, where they do one thing, we do the other. And of course, on our side, that should be some calibrated sanctions relief. And so far, the U.S. is saying it's not willing to do that.
So, at the Hanoi summit, particularly after Steve Biegun gave his speech at Stanford University days before the summit, I and many others, I don't know if you were among them, got very optimistic because Steve seemed to be outlining a deal.
Yes.
That an interim deal, that they close Yongbyon, the plutonium production facility, some uranium enrichment, and in exchange the U.S. would provide some significant sanctions relief. But that appears to be what Bolton killed with his go big approach. We seem to be inching back towards exploration of that kind of deal. What do you think the prospects are? And would that be sound? Should the United States be willing to accept something that starts to look a lot like the 1994 agreed framework, or, I don't want to say this too loudly, the Iran anti-nuclear agreement?
I know. You think these guys would have a little more humility knowing how hard this is, and when they compare it to the robustness of the Iran deal. But that's the topic for another podcast.
Okay.
But I think in the case of North Korea, again, I think the political dynamics here in Washington are going to play into it. The president has to be reelected. I think if he's not reelected, he's probably going to jail. He probably knows that too. He may be indicted. So he needs to be reelected. And when you look at his record on the foreign policy side of the ledger, I can't think of a single win at all. I mean, the closest that comes to a single win, and this is spinning it, is North Korea. And they do spin it. And I think that's what this latest encounter at the DMZ was about. So I am hoping that the president sees he has to deliver something concrete.
Yes.
The pomp, the pageantry is only going to take him so far. So my hope is that because he is in the swing of this reelection campaign, he will be a little more flexible and instruct his negotiators to pursue some sort of deal.
So what do you make of the criticism by many in this town that Trump should not be legitimizing a ruthless dictator? He shouldn't be meeting with him. He shouldn't be exchanging letters with him.
I'm really irked. It's one of my pet peeves. Mm-hmm. You know, I live in New York. I come to this town every week. But that is one of my biggest pet peeves, the thinking that it's pervasive in this town. When you engage an adversary, you are making concession just by the act of that engagement. Well, as the saying goes, you don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies, and I'm a big proponent of diplomacy. I know you are too, Joe. And how else are we supposed to solve these issues unless we meet face to face? When I look at the Iran deal, skipping back to that, one mistake I think the Obama administration made was not taking it further. The fact that Obama didn't meet Rouhani.
Yes.
The fact that we didn't begin more ambitious discussions on the region, and the Iranians are to blame for this too. I think if we had moved that dial, it would have been harder for Trump to back out of the nuclear deal.
Right. Democrats seem to forget that Obama was criticized for talking with the Iranians because it was legitimizing a ruthless regime.
Yes.
Exactly the charge leading Democrats now make against Trump. They're boxing themselves in, don't you think? If they are so lucky as to regain the White House, Are they going to be able to meet
Yes.
with these people to negotiate what they would see as a principal deal?
It's so puzzling to me why they would cut off options before they're even in, in the primary. I'm a full believer in engagement. This whole business of bestowing legitimacy in whose eyes? I'd like, the people of North Korea. I don't think so. I think we need to banish that trope.
Right.
Move on, and all the diplomats I know that have engaged either North Korea, Iran, and so forth, it's hard work.
Right.
And,
Right.
it is really tough, and it's not for wusses. It's really tough.
Right. Even getting to the point where you can reach an agreement, negotiating the details of the agreement, defending the agreement, sustaining the agreement. This goes on and on and on and on. So you have to be tough-nosed about it. The problem isn't the meeting, it's the meaning of the meeting.
Exactly.
Are you advancing U.S. interests, U.S. values as you do this, which brings us to your new institute.
Yes.
Which is a breath of fresh air in this town that's going to advance a principled, sort of realist view of American interests. Can you tell us a little bit about it, including the full name?
Okay, so the full name is a mouthful. It's the John Quincy Adams Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So, I noticed some people are trying to pigeonhole us already. Because
this is Washington. We think simply here.
Because we are
labels.
against permanent war, the state of permanent war that we've been in for decades now. The notion is we're isolationist. It couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, I think we see robust diplomatic engagement. All the tools in the diplomacy toolbox need to be used to peacefully resolve conflicts. And I think, I can only speak for myself, but looking at the failures in foreign policy, catastrophic failures over the past couple of decades, it's time for something new. Yeah. And I think that's where this institute was born from. There's a lot of great people involved. You yourself, Joe, for full disclosure,
exactly.
are on the advisory board.
Thank you. And also, as the president of Ploughshares Fund, we're going to be considering a grant to the Quincy Institute.
That's really the reason for my visit today, is to persuade you to say yes.
So far, it's going very well.
But, the chairman...
Fortunately, our board decides, not me, so you should be meeting with them.
So the chairmanship of the board is a voluntary position. I'll still be happily a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But, people have asked me, why are you taking on an added responsibility in addition to your own more than full-time gig? And I'll tell you why. Because I think the time demands it.
Yes.
The circumstances we're in demand it. I have a daughter who just turned 15. I'm thinking about her future, and I think that changing the narrative in this town, we have to do it. We have to join forces across the aisle, conservatives, progressives. I'm on the progressive side.
Yes.
I am happy to work with conservatives towards this end, and that's why I personally am devoting the time to it.
I am with you on this, Suzanne. And that's why I'm involved, and I've been very impressed by the quality of the people that have been involved in this effort, just top-notch, including the interim president, Andrew Bacevich, who has impeccable national security credentials. And I've been very frustrated over the years to see the direction of the think tank discussions on national security. I mean, to say they're simplistic would be giving them a compliment. From both from the right and the left, they seem to be sort of competing with who could have the harder line on U.S. and what that means is that the national security debate in this town has moved towards the center right. That is sort of the natural resting place now for even so-called liberal institutions that we're familiar with. So we do need a counterbalance, and I'm glad
the fact that an institute with a laser-like focus on ending endless wars is considered revolutionary tells you that something is seriously wrong. This should not be a revolutionary idea. It should be the norm that, it's not a pacifist approach. Of course, force is always on the table, but in this case, and looking forward, it's got to be a last resort.
So I haven't been involved in the details for the last couple of months, but I think the plan is to open up the doors of the
Yes.
Institute in September.
That'll be a soft launch in September, and the full launch will be in November. So just in time for
Conference, a party? What are we going to do in November?
I don't know, Joe. We're actually talking through those important details right now.
And how big is this going to be?
Well, right now we're a very small, lean, and not so mean group. Actually, kind of nice group. But we have a very large group of advisors. We plan to hire someone to head up our Middle East work. We plan to hire someone to head up our East Asia work. There's something called democratizing foreign policy. That'll be a whole other stream of work. So we've got a lot of work to do before we launch.
So where do candidates write for more information?
To you, Joe.
To me? No. Is there a website?
Yes,
email
there's
address?
a website. I think it's quincyinst.org.
Okay.
And it's just a splash page right now.
Great. We'll
So
provide
we'll
a
be
link.
filling it out soon.
We'll provide a link on the page for this podcast so
Thank
people
you.
can go there.
Thanks, Joe.
Well,
You've been a great supporter, and we appreciate it.
We have a lot of work to do.
We do.
Let's hope we can get through the next 18 months without a major war, a major crisis. Thank you very much, Suzanne, for coming in and sharing your insights with us.
It's always great to talk to you, Joe. And congrats to you and Ploughshares for all the great work you do.
Thank you. It's very kind.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.